This video will take a look at ATP and the role of ATP in biochemical reactions. So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and ATP is used to store and to transfer energy. This is a short-term energy storage solution, and this is something that is used in all organisms to supply energy for different processes like active transport and anything else that requires energy, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. For the structure of ATP, it's a nucleic acid. It's going to have a nitrogen base, which is adenine. It's going to have a 5-carbon sugar, which in this case is ribose, and it's going to have 3 phosphate groups. The 3 phosphate groups are what's going to be responsible for storing and then releasing energy, and which allows ATP to do the job that it does. The function of ATP is to store and transfer energy in the short term. Whenever we look at ATP will go through hydrolysis. This is going to be the breaking of bonds, and it's going to mean that ATP goes then to ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, plus a phosphate. Whenever hydrolysis happens and the breaking of bonds happens, energy is going to be able to be released in this instance. The opposite of that will be dehydration synthesis. So this is going to be the formation of bonds. This is going to be when ADP, or adenosine diphosphate, joins with the phosphate group. It's going to require a little bit of energy to add this phosphate on to then make ATP. Sometimes I like to think about ATP as the charged battery, and then ADP as the uncharged battery. So it has a lower energy overall than ATP. So ATP is a higher charged molecule, and it wants to transfer that energy somewhere else in order for cell processes to happen. Here's just another picture of how this might happen. So ADP down here on the bottom, so if we look at ADP down here on the bottom, it might get energy from food or from sunlight to add a phosphate group to make ATP and make the battery charged. Then ATP is going to transfer that phosphate group to something else in order to provide energy for the cells. The energy that ATP transfers is going to be used for different cell processes. So we're going to use it to carry out processes like active transport, which we talked about, where things are moving against the concentration gradient across the cell membrane. It's going to power movement, so moving your muscles, things like that. It's going to help to synthesize or to make proteins. It's going to help in the response to chemical signals. It's maybe going to help to produce light like you might see in a firefly. So ATP is very essential and important, and it's important that we're able, or that organisms are able to make ATP from the food that they ingest. So most cells, they are taking food and they're creating ATP to use for all those cell processes, but most cells only have ATP to last enough for a few seconds of activity. So ATP is better for short term. It's for transferring energy. It's not really for storing energy for a long term or for a long time. Glucose, though, is used for long-term energy storage. So glucose is made during photosynthesis. It's going to store 90 times more energy than what ATP is going to store. And so glucose is going to be important because this is how the energy will be present in organisms for the most part, and then organisms will go through cellular respiration to break glucose down into ATP. The energy for ATP comes from the chemical components of food, so it's breaking down the chemical energy in food or in glucose into chemical energy in the form of ATP. When we look at ATP, we like to also talk about heterotrophs and autotrophs. We mentioned autotrophs with photosynthesis. These are going to be organisms that make their own food, and energy in almost all food molecules is actually going to come from the sun. And so this makes sense because photosynthesis is using sunlight to make glucose. Heterotrophs are going to be organisms that obtain food by consuming other living things. So things like us or other animals, we would be heterotrophs. When we look at photosynthesis, photosynthesis is going to be the process of transforming light energy into chemical energy that's stored in the bonds of carbohydrates.